Byzantine Empire survived, remained for centuries in effective power in the Eastern Mediterranean, although it lessened in strength somewhat. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Mediterranean world in late antiquity. We're going to talk about the influence of religion, the art of the Roman Empire in that late and period. Talk about how Roman art and architecture changed as a result of Christianity and the decisions of Constantine. We'll talk about influence of specific images of Christ. One thing that I think is super interesting about this period is, I mean, lots of folks, especially like living in the United States, you've seen images of Christ. Like when you think about, like, how do you start a new religion? If you think about like Christianity, like from its like conception or from the very beginning, like how would you decide to like invent or create art that meant something to people? Again, what we're going to see is, again, in I'm not going to flog this dead horse forever because we've got like a lot of stuff on the back. But early Christian art oftentimes presented Christ in the same or similar ways that Greek and Roman gods had been shown before, because basically they were borrowing from these earlier religious traditions, because that's what people have a tendency to do, right? And well, oh, we want this guy to look like that, but maybe somehow somewhat different. We're going to talk a little bit about the origins and development of the specific images of Christ. And we'll kind of move on. And again, one of the things we're going to talk about, besides like how this religious imagery like relates to advertising the religion, promoting the religion, explaining the religion, educating people on like what they're supposed to be buying into, and what the religion's meant to represent, and what the benefits are and the pluses and minuses, right? We'll also talk about how those religious images like are related to like political power. This is the painted ceiling of a cubiculum, okay? And this painted ceiling is in the catacomb of Saints Peter and Marcellinus in Rome. Okay? So below the city of Rome, I don't know if you know this, there's like all these subterranean caves and tunnels where they buried their dead. They were like those Roman sarcophaguses that we saw last week, like with the couple that looked like you startled them and they popped up in bed and were like, "Are you okay? Do you need something?" We were just resting. In those same said catacombs that the Romans buried their dead in sarcophagi, these Christians were going there and holding sometimes secret meetings, because the religion was in its initial phases illegal, it was outlawed, it was not allowed, so they're meeting in secret, oftentimes in the catacombs. And some of the earliest Christian art was found like almost like graffiti, almost like tagging in these kind of makeshift spaces that they would occupy and hold these kind of services promoting the religion. Go ahead.
Is that the Peter?
Yes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, Saint Peter. We'll talk later about the construction of, or the replacement of the old St. Peter's Basilica and the construction of the new St. Peter's in the Roman cluster. So here is the story. This presents the image of Christ in the visage of the visage or the role of the good shepherd. It also presents the story of Jonah and the Orants. I can't remember what the Orants are. If there's anyone who's more religious than me, you can refamiliarize me, because I know the story. And like many, many things that have happened to me in my life, by the time you're 55, you'll have learned so many things, and you'll have forgotten some of those things that you've learned. It'll be shocking. books with what I've learned and then forgotten subsequently. But again, we'll stick with the couple that we know unless someone wants to illuminate us all about the Pharaohs. But let's kind of know there's some damage here to the ceiling of this cubiculum in the catacombs. But what can you kind of discern or what can you see here? A couple of these things are concerned. They kind of look like they're bowing. The jazz hands, kind of? What's going on? What's going on? We can figure out probably usually the most important person is located where, right?
Middle.
In the center. So we know who that is? Big stab?
Jesus.
Yeah, it's Christ as shepherd, and everyone kind of gets like why the shepherd. Yeah, he's guiding the people and kind of leading the people in the right direction and keeping them that quote unquote people like keeping those people safe and guiding them on their spiritual journey, more or less kind of like the way that a shepherd takes care of and tends to a flock of sheep. And again, he's seen here right now. A couple things that are pretty interesting. Take a look, they're still interested in presenting the figure with that contrapposto or that weight shift. Do you see that? And again, go ahead.
Do you know what they used to paint this with?
It's a bunch of different mineral pigments that is not dissimilar to like the kind of pigments that they used in fresco painting. I don't know if there's any kind of material difference too, but it's like along that continuum. But again, it's pretty great. It's pretty archival, right? The other thing that's interesting too, you know what he's got draped around his neck? Yes, a lamp. It's not a star. But again, these images are borrowed, and I can't remember offhand what the name of that god is, but like it's borrowed from Roman. This god as shepherd and in this kind of pastoral scene. Here, this is the scene where it's Jonah and the whale. Remember the Old Testament story where Jonah's swallowed up by the whale, hangs out for a few days, and then figures out his way back out. But again, you can see it's kind of like abstract a little bit, but you can see the four spokes of the cross too. It's kind of an abstract cross. Too. Christ seen here more clearly, or kind of get a better idea of how Christ is presented in the earliest forms. And again, it's partially because the painters of these religious scenes don't have these highly developed, sophisticated kind of visual cues developed to kind of convey the important elements of the story to the would-be practitioners that they hope to appeal to. This one is a little bit taller than 3 feet. It's from about the year 300. And this one's in the Vatican Museum of Rome. Does this look like anything we've seen before? It's pretty big. It looks like a Greek statue, maybe not as technically well executed as like the best. Let's talk a little bit about artistic changes, how and why religious ideas are expressed in the art of the early Christian period. Here, this is a photograph of the interior of Santa Costanza in Rome. And again, another element of early Christian art and architecture that's borrowed from Orthodox church, again, this is a centrally planned church, whereas churches in the West are generally in that kind of rectangular basilica form, and this is one that is decidedly Eastern in nature. Really quite lovely, I think, and again, you can see, even at the very beginning, the kind of emphasis on getting the worshipper's eyes to point heavenward. Additionally, you can see other elements borrowed from the Greco-Roman world too, right? Greek columns, that third emergent order in Greece. This is, the capitals here are not Doric or Ionic, but those are Corinthian capitals. You can see the semicircular Roman style arches bearing the load for here. So again, these early Christian churches borrowing liberally from the pagan tradition. Questions about this one so far? Again, these churches, mostly at the very beginning, are pretty intimate. You know, they're not expecting huge, audiences or huge, they're not serving huge numbers, and again, they're kind of having to keep it on the down low. Right, these are not like authorized, these are meetings that are not authorized by the state. Detail of the vault mosaic in the ambulatory of Santa Costanza. You're in the same place in Rome. I think really beautiful mosaic tiles here. The execution is like pretty amazing. There's a variety of imagery here. Again, this isn't like my area of like the deepest well of knowledge in terms of like my presentation of a lot of this stuff. So if someone asked me why the duck, I don't know. There's probably a reason. Yeah. And then again, you can see elements of architecture. You can see faces and head and bust of the saints. You can see people working and harvesting. It's like they're worshiping a whole bunch of stuff. This one's pretty great. This is an early work of figurative art telling of the story of crucifixion of Christ, one that's less popular with Christians, but it's showing the crucifixion of Christ on the right and the suicide of Judas. I grew up in a Lutheran church and didn't really focus on that part so much. I think I had a more PG version of the Christian story presented to me as a young Lutheran fellow. Go ahead.
It's interesting to me that you said that's less popular because I'm much more familiar with the Catholic and Presbyterian, specifically Catholic.
Yeah, it's probably more
I
lean.
love this theme. There's a lot of bloody Christ on a
Right.
cross in New Mexico.
Yeah, for sure. And again, it's one of those things that is an interesting thing. If you were raised Protestant, particularly if you were raised in one of the more liberal Protestant traditions like the Lutherans. I mean, literally, like all the churches that the Lutheran churches of the more progressive branch of the Lutheran church, like the architecture looks like mid-century modernism, and there's crosses, and there's loaves, and there's fishes, and there's doves and stuff like that, but there's no bloody Jesus. There's certainly no hanged Judas. You know what I mean? So like that's a more Catholic thing, and we'll see more of that. And I think part of what some of you will be like, oh my God, I have to look at all this religious stuff. I think you'll find that it's like more nuanced and complex and interesting than that, because you'll see parts of the world, but like the Germans are really going to lean in to some super gory images of Christ, and like both Christ crucified, what's called the Pietà in Italian, the pity, in both Italy, where you've got the mother of Christ holding her dead child before he's going to be buried. You'll see it in Germany, where like it's super it's shockingly like abstract and almost looks like a 20th century German expressionist artwork. So again, you'll see the different regional interpretations of that, whether it's in the Near East, or like Western Europe, and we're talking about like in the United States, different kind of takes on that are focused on different things. Yeah, this is an interesting one, right? This is carved from ivory. You can see the ivory's discolored or darkened a little bit over 1,500 years. This thing's only about almost like 3 by 4 inches. So it's small. How are the figures conveyed? What's like the impression it leaves on you, or what's your impression? Yeah, it's pretty somber. I think it's like a reminder of like the seriousness of like the subject and the story. But it's also interesting too, we'll talk about, or at least I'm interested in talking about how Christ is like, when you see Christ, it's meant to like represent a thing, right? Again, in the story, I'm not the idea is that like, quickly, it's like the idea that in the Old Testament of the Bible, because the serpent tricked Adam and Eve into eating the apple, they're filled with sin. Subsequently, all generations of human beings are born with sin. And then God sends his son to be born and live and then die on the cross to atone for our sins. That's how we all get the magic key to the kingdom, as long as we have faith and embrace this tradition, right? That's kind of the idea in a nutshell. Sure. But again, sometimes we see Christ shown as like the symbol to that thing, and then sometimes like the artwork kind of leans in to like his experience of the suffering. Does that make sense? And sometimes it looks like he's just hanging there chilling. It's quite, again, different, again, they look a little cartoony, don't they? Kind of look almost like, in some ways, like the figures don't seem to like belie the seriousness of it, but I still think it works. From the nave, the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, again about 5th century of the Common Era. The parting of Abraham and Lot, Old Testament story. I don't remember the story very well. Is there anything interesting about these tiles, like these mosaics that you've seen so far? Do you have any questions about them? We'll look at a bunch of these again. I think it's interesting seeing how there's kind of a combination. Can you see like where they're trying to even convey the suggestion of the cheekbones and the shading and the three-dimensional modeling and the figures? I think there's this lovely kind of tension there between that impulse and that effect that's actually pretty, gives it the figures some sort of suggestion or the illusion of some life and some three-dimensionality, but it's almost like, it's like tiny cubism, right? There's that kind of like abstracting the figures in a way that is also, I think, got this real charm to it. So let's talk a little bit about Rome and Ravenna, what's important about these cities. Talk about the enduring influence of the classical pagan world in the development of Christian art in Rome. I guess I've kind of already hit on that. I'm kind of talking about how the Christians weren't able to like just develop a whole education of art and a whole new iconography. They're borrowing from earlier traditions, particularly the Greco-Roman one. Talk about the new aesthetic. And again, one thing that's interesting too, it's interesting to see how early Christian artists use mosaics in particular, and when they're making paintings, they almost lean into this idea of flatness, or making these figures look beautiful, elegant, highly recognizable, but they really seem to de-emphasize an urge towards or an interest in realism. Does that make sense? Because if the artwork was if the figures in the artwork were too real, there's this kind of idea where they're brushing up against this idea of blasphemy because their concern is whether it seems reasonable or not. The blasphemy comes with that idea that you're not supposed to worship false idols. And if the people are worshiping the idols rather than God, it was seen as blasphemous. Does that make sense? So again, there's this interest in de-emphasizing naturalism. Here we see yet again Christ presented as the Good Shepherd. This was a popular representation of Christ, and one that people could recognize and kind of it was appealing, I guess. This is from the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna, Italy, again 5th century. A pretty fabulous mosaic and really pretty shockingly excellent shape. Still some 1,500 years later. Is this one any different, or do you have any comments or questions about this one? Go ahead.
I think this is the first one that it may have been present in the previous ones, but I hadn't noticed. This is the first time I noticed the red scarf on Jesus, which I know is a very common image later on. Like sort of over the shoulder going across his lap.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting presentation. We're already seeing the kind of the presentation of the halo there. We'll see that sometimes elaborated on, where you see the halo with the cross present in that halo too, given to indicate Christ and allude to that eventual end. But again, I think it's pretty interesting too. Again, here maybe because I always understand the context, but again, I think that the way that the artist has chosen to convey a certain substantial amount of landscape. You know what I mean? It's not a very convincing landscape. It's kind of like a abstracted or simplified landscape. But again, you can see the grass, the plants on the ground. You can see that the rocks, bless you, the rocks and the shrubs in the background. What we're going to see happen, partially, again, I think to emphasize this idea of immateriality, or to de-emphasize that Greco-Roman urge towards naturalism or realism. A lot of times we'll see the backgrounds in art from this period of the Christian art disappear. Go ahead.
I also noticed that all of the sheep are looking towards him as if he is even listening for everything, but that he's just kind of looking away and nonchalant.
Right. Yeah. No. He's kind, right? He's petting this sheep. These sheep are all looking to him because he's the one that kind of knows the way and knows, what they help, and that's again, that's kind of again in the early stages of the church. This was a very highly legible message that appealed to folks, because a lot of these people weren't reading the Bible at this point. We're going to see books. The books were hand copied from other books, and a lot of times even the really great calligraphers weren't very good at reading. They were good at copying. Does that make sense? And books were, it's hard to believe in a day and age where it's hard to get anyone to read a book, that books were really once very precious and valuable, and it was unusual and a real privilege to be able to read well and have access these folks that they're trying to appeal to, right, their audience, mostly could. Here we see another mosaic from San Apollinaire and Nuovo in Ravenna. Again, Ravenna is one of the great cities in Italy, not known for its Renaissance art, but for its medieval art. So again, I think if I'm jonesing to go back to Italy, and I was going to try to go next summer with my son before he goes off to school, but he nixed it. Yes, that ungrateful little bastard. He's lovely. But anyway, I think I'm gonna go in 2 years when he's either matured enough or just without it all together with my wife. And one thing is like you hear about like it's just gotten more and more touristy. It wasn't even in the old days, but the cities that bless you, the cities that have the best like Renaissance art are the cities mostly that are like absolutely overrun with tourists. And the cities in Italy that have more of this kind of medieval stuff are really lovely too. And they have not, so I might go with that. Miracle of the loaves and fishes, we know that story, folks know that story, right? Again, it's a pretty easy story for people to relate to. And again, I think when we're looking this earlier Christian art, they're sticking mostly with stories that are easy to understand, not because the people are stupid, but because they haven't been reading the stories and they're trying to go with like the stuff that appeals, right? Christ in his travels happens upon a village where they can't, they're unable to like catch fish for a long time, so people are hungry, and he goes out, asks them to cast the nets into the water one more time, and they're like, go at yourself, right? We've been fishing for days and there's nothing there. Believe me. He's like, no, please just try again. They throw the nets in and it's full of fish. I can't remember how he somehow provides bread. I can't remember that part of the story. But again, here, do you see how like the background or like the landscape that I'm talking about is pretty rendered with a certain degree of detail? This is more common, there's a little detail there, but you see like how there is some green in the ground to kind of to make the figures feel like they're not just floating in space. But again, take a look at the background behind. What color?
Gold.
It's like yellow gold, right? And what we're gonna see is that they start leaning more into this really bright gold, and sometimes even using gold leaf in the background to be like a kind of stand-in for this otherworldly plane. So it's like suggesting the figures aren't present with us, but they might even be like in heaven. And sometimes we're gonna see a lot of the figures, the green of the ground disappears and they start looking like they're kind of floating. They almost look like these kind of apparitions, and it makes them look less naturalistic, but I think that's partially purposeful to kind of convey this idea that these are illustrations. They're meant to be beautiful, elegant illustrations of people from stories and make them seem less naturalistic. Does that make sense? Here you see, do you see the three? You see the three green emerald colored gems in the halo? Those are the three spokes of the cross again. That he's the only one that gets that halo. It suggests that he's saved. He's the only one that has that cross in his halo for his make reference to crucifixion. We'll take a break at 10:30 if that's not too late. I'm doing okay. I'm not meandering as badly as usual. Sticking to the story as much as I can. So, the Byzantine Empire. The term Byzantine has kind of two meanings. Very specifically, it is the empire. It is a Christian empire in this kind of early to middle medieval period during the development of popular development of Christianity, or the development of Christianity into this widespread and popular religion during this time. And this is a map of that empire and the land that they control as of about the year 565 of the Common Era. And we're gonna see here, we just were looking at that, those mosaics from Ravenna there in Italy. It describes the kind of art that is very complex and layered and colorful. And again, it's kind of a good term. Sometimes people use the term Byzantine in a more general terms to describe anything that's like really complex or convoluted and hard to kind of get to the bottom or kind of glean the truth from it. Again, you can see here during this period of empire, there are other considerable kingdoms on the rise too. The kingdom of the Visigoths here in Spain, what would be today's Spain and Portugal, and also the kingdom of the Franks, which would be mostly like what is it now, like France, maybe was in the Netherlands a little bit, and maybe part of Switzerland and Germany. We're going to talk about Byzantine art is generally divided up into three distinct periods, and I know you're not going to be tested on this, but I think it's maybe helpful to just kind of suggest this kind of timeline. We'll talk first about the early Byzantine. The Emperor Constantine adopts Christianity in 330, decides to move the capital from Rome to Constantinople. We already talked about this. This event already happened in our class last week. Moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, at the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. We're going to be talking very soon about the Middle Byzantine period. And a period of crisis for the arts called the Iconoclastic Controversy. The Iconoclastic Controversy, I think, is pretty interesting, which is a period when the use of religious images was hotly contested, debated amongst Christians if it was okay to make images of Christ, images of the Virgin, images of other persons of importance from the Old Testament. Okay? We'll talk also about the late Byzantine, when crusaders from Western Europe invade and capture Constantinople in 1204. They temporarily topple the empire, and as they are making an attempt to bring the Eastern Empire back into the fold of Western Christendom. Okay? So we're going to kind of dovetail into the rise of Islam. And that will be plenty material to look into today. So we're going to kind of not cover everything, but we're going to cover a lot of the material and a lot of the period of time in Europe, even in the Near East, from the fall of the Roman Empire until like the beginnings of kind of like the Proto-Renaissance period. We'll talk about art in the age of Justinian. We'll talk about how Byzantine art. Okay? Byzantine art can be seen as kind of an amalgam of Roman, Christian, and Eastern artistic influences, developing all mixed together and seeing this kind of multicultural kind of art we call Byzantine. Okay, it's kind of hard to put your fingers on it exactly, but I think when you see it, you'll kind of get, when we talking about this is Byzantine style art, but you'll be able to see how you'll be able to see the influences that was listed in that art. talk about characteristics of the architecture of the period, particularly the Church of Hagia Sophia in San Vitale. We'll talk about artistic forms and iconography of the Byzantine mosaics, and lastly, the religious controversies, that iconoclasm that I just talked about. Here, this is an aerial view of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, today called Istanbul, Turkey, built between 532 and 537. Okay? Most architectural critics, folks that tend to agree, like one of the greatest, one of the most important architectural works in the history of the world. This is the Hagia Sophia, or Church of Holy Wisdom. The building was ordered, funded at the request of the Emperor Justinian, and it is the greatest architectural project of that period. We know the names of the two architects that designed it: Anthemius of Trail and Isidorus of Miletus, two architects that designed this building that was first built as a Christian basilica. Okay? You see the four minarets on the corners? It was later converted to a mosque. So it was a Christian church and it was an Islamic mosque. And then later it was converted back to briefly to a basilica, Christian basilica again. Today it is like one of the UNESCO, great architectural heritage sites as listed, and there's the elements of the basilica plan there, there's elements of the building that were added when it was converted to a mosque, and you can see kind of all of that. And in some ways it's a building that speaks to the history of the place. Really lovely from the exterior, probably even more lovely in the interior. Here at the top, you'll see the plan. Kind of an interesting part of the plan is the dome rests on this architectural kind of transition. So part of that architectural invention created here to serve, they're called pendentives. And these pendentives here, I think you can see them in here. But you see the areas, like the pendentives are an architectural invention that these architects had to figure out how you fit a semicircular dome elegantly. How do you set that on top of a square roof? And that has to serve, so that dome is 180 feet at its greatest height. The dome sits on pendentives that serve the problem of how to place a dome on a circular dome on a square. Again, you can see the cutaway at the bottom. And here, a photograph from the interior. Photograph of the interior is pretty, you can see it's really pretty lovely in the interior. It's almost kind of confusing. The photographer took this photo from the second floor. Can you see that? And the first floor ceiling is at a really great height. I don't know if I'd say the first floor ceiling, so where the photographer's sitting, they're probably 35 or more like 40 feet up in the air. Okay? So it gives that viewpoint where you can kind of take in the whole of the church. You can see on the far end, you can see these later additions, the Arabic calligraphy and these medallions when they converted the church to a mosque. I think some other things you notice, you get a good look at the dome. in the dome, how you can see like there's so many windows punched out of the bottom of the dome almost seems to float. And again, you can see the element of the dome at the center, where it was again retrofitted to convert this from a church to a mosque. Again, that really elegant Arabic script. Calligraphy again there. And then the other thing that's a little bit tough to read, but again, I think it's really interesting too. So the photographer from this point of view, looking down, you can see the lights. You can see like the lights that are hanging there on those very long chains. They almost look like they're illuminated like cables, but they're not. They're some sort of modern electrical lamps. Any questions about this one so far? We'll talk about it a little bit more maybe. Has anyone been here? You have?
Couple times.
Really?
Yeah, it's actually a working mosque once more. A couple years ago, Erdogan decreed, I believe, that it's now a mosque.
So it's switched back?
You can't go on the second floor anymore, and unfortunately, a lot of the medieval mosaics on the second floor are no longer visible to the public. But
Interesting, so again, these,
beautiful.
I mean, it's interesting how like these important works of art or works of architecture, like their roles or the way that they function change over history depending on, you know, politics, right? So is the first floor still open to the public as like a touristic? Because again, like if you go to Istanbul, is this like the number one? This is the number one, right?
Very much.
It's like
Yeah,
it's
even
the
though
number one
it's a-
tourist attraction for folks with it.
Yeah, and it's a working mosque, so like when you're in there, there are certain areas where, you know, you're not supposed to go. If there's a prayer happening, you have to remove your shoes, but they still allow tourists on the bottom floor, so, yeah, it's great.
So again, this church built in some ways to, you know, as a political move, again, Justinian is, you know, the emperor there, even though their power is waning somewhat, wanting to make a statement about their empire and about the power of, you know, both the empire and the power of the church in this eastern capital city. Let's take a break now. This is a good time to take a break.